I never imagined that one day I would stand before my own son and daughter-in-law, holding in my hands a will powerful enough to tear this family apart piece by piece. Yet that night, I found myself doing exactly that. Because truth, no matter how long it is buried, has a way of clawing itself back to the surface. The house was cloaked in silence, broken only by the soft glow of chandeliers and the relentless ticking of the old grandfather clock. The dining table, once meant for warmth and celebration, had turned into a battlefield. Across from me sat my son, his eyes clouded with confusion and pain, caught between blood and loyalty. Beside him, his wife's gaze burned with hunger, her smile a mask stretched too tight, hiding the greed and resentment beneath. In that suffocating stillness, I knew there was no turning back. I had to strip away every illusion, to force into the open what had been festering in the shadows for years. And when the words finally left my mouth calm, deliberate, and irreversible, they landed like stones dropped into a still pond, sending ripples that shattered every fragile bond holding us together. What I revealed that night did not just change the future of my estate. It ripped through the fragile fabric of my family, leaving love, betrayal, and truth all laid bare on the table. At 67, I came to realize a truth that few dare to admit. Retirement is not the golden age people often speak of with such optimism, at least, not for me. The pension I received each month was modest, barely stretching far enough to cover necessities. My health had begun its slow decline, aching joints on cold mornings, fatigue that clung to me even after rest, and the quiet reminder that I was no longer the man I once had been. After my divorce, life grew lonelier still. The silence of an empty house had a way of pressing in on me, reminding me daily that I had no partner to lean on, no one waiting for me when I returned home. My only child, my son Ethan, lived with his wife Vanessa in a suburban home just outside the city. After many hesitant conversations and my persistent appeals, they finally agreed to let me move in with them. It was not a decision made lightly, nor one without tension. Ethan, at 40 years old, was a good man at heart. He treated me with respect, his words always polite, his gestures kind. Yet, I could see the conflict within him. He lacked the courage to stand up for me when it mattered most, especially when Vanessa was present. In those moments, his silence spoke louder than his words, and though I never voiced my disappointment, it weighed heavily on me. Vanessa Chaffee, formerly Gilmore, was 38 years old, and carried herself with the air of someone who had long ago decided she must dominate every room she entered. She was sharp, calculating, and domineering, a woman who seemed to thrive on control. Her golden hair was always styled into elaborate curls that looked more suited for a banquet hall than a quiet evening at home. Every strand seemed sprayed into place as though chaos itself dared not touch her. Her long, crimson-painted nails tapped incessantly on countertops, tabletops, or the arm of a chair, a staccato rhythm that announced her authority before she ever spoke. And when she did speak, her voice rang out high-pitched and cutting, dripping with disdain so sharp it seemed to reverberate against the walls, making even the air itself shrink back. She moved through the house like a general inspecting her troops. Her sharp eyes missed nothing: a dish towel folded unevenly, a cup left half an inch off-center, or a cushion angled slightly askew on the sofa. Each small imperfection was, to her, an offense worthy of interrogation. Nothing escaped her scrutiny, and nothing passed without commentary. In her domain, order was absolute, and the penalty for disturbing that order was her voice, loud, piercing, merciless. And I, of course, was her favorite target. It was as if my mere presence provided her with endless ammunition. The way I folded my laundry was sloppy. The way I sliced bread was pathetic. Even something as involuntary as a cough seemed to ignite her irritation. "Henry, must you make so much noise? Even your breathing turns into a nuisance," she would sneer, her lips curling as if she had just tasted something bitter. Her eyes slid over me, not with the acknowledgement of a family member, but with the dismissiveness reserved for an unwelcome boarder. Meals were the worst. What should have been simple family dinners felt instead like courtroom sessions, with Vanessa presiding as both judge and jury. She scrutinized everything. The way I cut a piece of bread uneven, she'd scowl, or how I held my fork, her sharp gaze measuring each misplaced inch. If I coughed into my napkin, her eyes would roll with such exaggerated annoyance that I often wished I could disappear entirely. Each meal became an ordeal, every bite swallowed under the weight of her criticism. The bitter irony was not lost on me. I paid to endure this hostility. $1,200 left my hands each month, exchanged for a room that barely measured 10 square meters. Inside was a squeaky old bed that groaned under my weight, a rickety wardrobe that wobbled when I opened it, and a wooden desk scarred with scratches that told the story of years of use. A single, narrow window faced the brick wall of the neighboring house, blocking out both sunlight and view, leaving the room in a constant state of dim, airless gloom. $1,200. For that price, I could have rented a modest apartment in some working-class neighborhood, a place where I might have at least felt ownership, but I chose to stay here. I chose humiliation over solitude for one reason alone: my son, Ethan. I told myself that being near him mattered more than comfort, that enduring his wife's hostility was a small price to pay for proximity to my only child. Yet, in the quiet moments, when her sharp words lingered like bruises on my heart, I often wondered if I had made a grave mistake. My only relief came on weekends, when Ethan and Vanessa drove out to visit her parents. In those brief hours, the house transformed. Silence returned like a long-lost friend, filling the rooms with a peace so fragile I feared even to breathe too deeply lest it shatter. No sharp heels clattered across the hardwood floors, no shrill reprimand sliced the air. For once, I could open the window wide and draw a deep breath, even if all I saw was a blank brick wall. I allowed myself small luxuries. A pot of soup simmering slowly on the stove flavored exactly the way I liked it, without anyone hovering over my shoulder to criticize. The radio tuned to a classical station, strings filling the air with music that soothed the frayed edges of my soul. Or the quiet company of an old book, its pages worn thin from years of handling, as I sat beneath the soft yellow glow of a lamp in the living room. For once, I could sit there without feeling like an intruder. Those weekends taught me something profound. Freedom, I realized, was not always grand. It wasn't about adventures to far-off lands or luxuries bought with wealth. Freedom was the simple right to exist in peace, to cough without rebuke, to place a fork wherever I wished, to let music play without it being silenced mid-note. Freedom was soup simmering quietly on the stove while I read in a chair that didn't belong to anyone but me, even if just for a few hours. And yet, even in those fleeting moments of solace, guilt pressed down on me. Why should I need to wait until Vanessa left before I could feel human again? Why should my life depend on the absence of another? My heart ached with the knowledge that this was not what a home was meant to be. Still, I endured. I told myself, as I always did, that proximity to Ethan was worth the cost. That one day, perhaps, my son might see more clearly, see me and stand beside me. Until then, I bore the daily barbs of his wife, wearing endurance like armor and silence like a shield. It was one of those rare weekends when the house felt mercifully still. Ethan and Vanessa had gone to her parents, leaving behind only silence and the low whistle of the kettle beginning to heat on the stove. I had just reached for my favorite chipped teacup, savoring the promise of a quiet afternoon, when the sharp ding-dong of the doorbell sliced through the calm. The sound startled me. In this house, quiet was a fragile treasure, and the sudden chime echoed too loudly, bouncing against the walls like a summons. My heart lurched, and I wiped my palms on my trousers before shuffling to the door. When I opened it, the postman stood there with a parcel unlike any other I had ever received, a thick brown envelope, sealed with a red wax emblem. His uniform seemed almost ceremonial in that moment, as though he were delivering not a letter, but a verdict. My eyes caught the bold black print in the corner. Probate office. A dull throb began in my chest. My hand, as I reached for the clipboard, betrayed me with a tremor. The pen scratched unevenly across the line as I signed, my signature barely legible. Even the postman's polite nod seemed distant, muffled, as if the world outside had already receded, and all that existed was the weight of the envelope now pressed against my palm. I closed the door softly, almost reverently, and carried the envelope to the kitchen table. My knees bent slowly, lowering me into the chair as though I carried a burden too heavy to set down. I turned the package in my hands, studying the sharp corners, the seal glinting faintly in the afternoon light. My finger lingered along the adhesive line, hesitant. It felt as though the envelope was alive, pulsing with the power to change everything. At last, I tore it open carefully, painfully carefully, as though a reckless movement might shatter whatever fate had been written inside. The paper gave way with a soft rip, and I pulled free a sheaf of documents on fine cream letterhead. The law firm's name stared back at me in bold print, severe and final. The words marched down the page in neat, clinical rows, but at the bottom, in blue ink, a handwritten signature curved with undeniable weight. I leaned closer, lips moving unconsciously as I read each word, slow and deliberate, unwilling to miss a single syllable. And then I stopped cold. The letter informed me that my Aunt Margaret had passed away. My breath caught in my throat. But more than that, astonishing, incomprehensible, she had left her entire estate to me. A house, a significant sum of money, an inheritance I had never dared to imagine. My hand flew to my mouth, stifling a sound that was part gasp, part cry. Margaret, my mother's elder sister. The quiet woman who had lived her life near the sea, in a weathered wooden cottage that smelled always of salt and old paper. I had not seen her often, but her memory was vivid, her soft voice as she pressed old books into my small hands, the way her eyes glowed when she whispered, "Knowledge will take you further than gold ever will." I had thought her life small, private, unremarkable, and yet here she was from beyond the grave placing the weight of her legacy in my hands. The room seemed to tilt, the words blurred as I read them again, and then again, as though repetition could anchor me to reality. My forehead dampened with sweat. My hands shook so violently that my teacup toppled, spilling a stream of hot liquid across the table. The brown stains spread across the wood, seeping into the fibers, but I hardly noticed. My eyes were fixed on the lines that had rewritten my future. A strange sensation rippled through me, part elation, part dread. It was as though someone had flung open a great door I hadn't known existed, and beyond it lay a path glittering with promise, yet also shadowed with peril. My chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. Freedom, security, dignity, all of it lay within my grasp, but so too did uncertainty, the gnawing fear that this gift might draw envy, greed, or worse, destruction. For a long while I sat motionless, the letter trembling in my hands, caught between gratitude and terror. And deep inside, a single thought echoed, blessing or curse, this inheritance will change everything. The following week, I requested a day off from work, though in truth, my mind had scarcely been on my job since the letter arrived. Each night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the words of the probate letter looping endlessly in my mind. The estate of Margaret Chaffee is hereby transferred, over and over. The syllables pounded like waves against a fragile shoreline. I had never imagined myself as the heir to anything more than old regrets and fading photographs. And yet, here I was, on the cusp of something entirely new. That morning, I boarded the earliest bus, my hands trembling as I clutched the worn leather strap of my bag. The seats smelled faintly of dust and engine oil, and the low hum of the motor mixed with the rhythmic sway of the bus, making it feel as though I were drifting toward some half-dreamed reality. My chest rose and fell too quickly, my pulse fluttering like a boy on his very first solo journey, unsure whether the path ahead would end in triumph or humiliation. More than once, I pressed the folded letter between my fingers, reassuring myself it was real, that I had not simply conjured it out of desperation. When the driver called my stop on the outskirts of town, I stepped off and found myself on a tree-lined road, where the branches arched high above like cathedral rafters. The morning sun filtered through in broken shafts of gold, dappling the ground with shifting mosaics of light and shadow. My shoes crunched softly against gravel as I walked, each step measured, hesitant, my heart caught between disbelief and awe. A peculiar sensation stole over me as though I had walked this path before, not in life, but in the hazy corridors of childhood memory or some half-remembered dream. And then, through the thinning curtain of trees, I saw it. The house. It stood quietly, a two-story Victorian residence, dignified but softened by the embrace of time. Its once white paint had mellowed into a creamy hue, as if age itself had lent the home a gentler grace. Wooden balconies curved outward with a kind of old-world elegance, their railings casting delicate shadows across the facade. Tall windows, their glass still unclouded, caught the sunlight and threw it back in fractured gleams, like eyes opening after a long sleep. The front garden overflowed with life. Roses, their petals unfurling in deep crimson and pale pink, leaned against each other like whispering companions. Lilacs perfumed the air with a fragrance so thick it seemed to settle on my very skin. An ancient oak tree towered at the edge, its branches stretching protectively over the stone walkway. Its presence was commanding yet calming, as though it had been standing guard for centuries, waiting for me to finally arrive. My steps quickened of their own accord, though my throat tightened. Could this truly belong to me? Could a man who had so recently been treated like a burden now stand at the threshold of such beauty? My mind rebelled against the thought, even as my heart ached to believe it. Behind the house lay a small pond, clear as glass, the water catching the sun in shimmering fragments. Golden fish darted beneath the surface, their scales flickering like coins in motion, while two ducks glided lazily, leaving behind ripples that expanded in concentric rings. I rubbed my eyes, half expecting the vision to dissolve, half fearing it might. Yet it remained, still and steadfast, waiting to be claimed. "Mr. Chaffee?" The voice was gentle, pulling me back from the fog of wonder. I turned to see a middle-aged man approaching, his well-fitted gray suit and polished shoes speaking of quiet authority. His steps were measured, his expression composed but not cold. Extending a firm hand, he introduced himself. "Prescott, the solicitor handling your aunt's estate." His handshake was steady, grounding, anchoring me when I still felt as though the ground might shift beneath my feet. With a dignified patience, he handed me a thick folder, its edges sharp, its contents heavy with meaning. As he led me inside, the house seemed to breathe around us. The polished wood floors creaked softly under our weight, not in complaint but as though acknowledging a new chapter had begun. Dust motes drifted lazily in shafts of light that spilled through lace curtains, catching in the air like tiny, suspended stars. "This house," Prescott explained, his voice even but firm, "was left to you because your aunt admired your honesty and diligence. She wished for her legacy to rest in hands that would value it not merely as property, but as principle." His words struck me like the toll of a distant bell. My throat constricted. Margaret, my mother's elder sister, a woman whose life had seemed small, quiet, defined by her books and her solitude. And yet here she was, speaking louder than ever through the gift she had left behind. I remembered her wrinkled hands pressing dusty novels into mine, her eyes alight with the conviction that knowledge outlasts gold. I had thought her a figure fading into obscurity. Now I realized she had been watching, remembering, and most humbling of all trusting. "There were others who might have expected this house," Prescott continued, adjusting his glasses as his calm eyes searched my face. "But Margaret made her choice clear. She believed you alone were worthy of carrying forward the values she cherished." I could not reply. Words lodged in my throat, heavy and trembling. Gratitude warred with sorrow, pride tangled with disbelief. My fingers tightened around the folder until the edge bit into my skin, grounding me in the present. This house was not merely walls and timber, it was trust, it was memory, it was a legacy wrapped in silence, now unwrapped into my trembling hands. I stood there in that room, sunlight spilling over the polished wood, and felt the air press against me with its quiet weight. I was not simply an heir, I was a custodian. And from that moment, I vowed silently to honor what Margaret had given me, no matter the storm that might come. The inheritance process stretched on for several weeks, each day a restless blend of anticipation and unease. I found myself in constant correspondence with the probate office phone calls, confirming details, envelopes arriving thick with documents that required my signature, each step drawing me closer to something that still felt like a dream. I lived, during those weeks, between two worlds: the cramped little room in Ethan and Vanessa's house that I had long endured, and the distant promise of a grand Victorian home that might soon be mine. I decided not to mention any of it to Ethan or Vanessa, not yet. Part of me wanted to wait until every detail was finalized, certain that the house and money were truly secured. Another part of me feared that if I spoke too soon, the fragile flame of hope might be extinguished by Vanessa's suspicion, ridicule, or worse, her interference. Silence, for now, was my shield. Meanwhile, life under their roof became more suffocating by the day. The smallest misstep on my part became fuel for complaint. If I left a cup on the kitchen counter, Vanessa would purse her lips as though I had committed a grave sin. If my slippers scraped against the hardwood floor, she would snap her head around with a look of irritation. The air in the house was always heavy, thick with unspoken tension, ready to burst into scolding at any moment. One evening, the storm finally came. "Henry, could you clear your things out of the storage room?" Vanessa ordered, her hand planted firmly on her hip, her eyes narrowing as if I were nothing more than an inconvenient tenant. "We need the space for renovations." I looked at her for a long moment, my chest rising and falling slowly. Deep inside, a quiet satisfaction welled up, the secret knowledge that soon, very soon, her voice would no longer hold me captive. The corner of my mouth twitched, but I suppressed the smile, unwilling to betray what I knew. "All right," I replied evenly, my tone light, almost casual, as I rose from my chair. To her, I must have seemed the same weary old man she had long bullied, but within me, something stronger was taking root, a certainty that her words no longer had the power to wound me. A new future was waiting, and it was one she could not touch. Tuesday morning began like any other, but the moment I stepped into the Exalon building, I sensed something was off. The air felt heavier, charged with unease. The usual chorus of clattering keyboards was strangely muted, replaced by hushed whispers and nervous glances exchanged along the corridor. People nodded at one another in that secretive way that meant everyone knew something and no one dared to say it aloud. For 12 years, I had given this place my steady devotion. As a technical specialist, I had poured myself into projects that shaped the company's growth, spent late nights debugging stubborn systems, and took pride in never once missing a deadline. My attendance record was spotless, my reports always precise. I had thought those things mattered. Now, as I walked past the gray cubicles and the familiar hum of fluorescent lights, I wondered if any of it counted for anything at all. "Henry," a voice whispered urgently near my desk. It was Doris, a colleague who had worked beside me for years. She leaned in close, her eyes darting nervously up and down the aisle, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "They're preparing for layoffs." Her voice shook, low and hurried. The words landed like a blow to the chest. My heart sank, and for a moment it felt as though the floor had vanished beneath me, leaving me suspended in midair with nothing to hold on to. I knew all too well that I was one of the oldest employees in the department. In times of restructuring, age was rarely seen as experience. More often, it was the easiest excuse to cross a name off the payroll. That knowledge gnawed at me with merciless clarity. Still, I forced myself into my chair and powered on my computer. The screen flickered to life, and I began typing in lines of code as I always did, but my hands trembled so badly that I had to delete and retype the same commands again and again. Each passing minute dragged like an hour. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, every second hammering against my chest. No matter how hard I tried to focus, my mind kept drifting to the meeting scheduled later that day, the one that might very well determine the course of the rest of my life. At exactly 9 o'clock, the conference room was packed to capacity. Yet the usual chatter of colleagues was absent. No one dared to speak above a whisper. The only sounds were the scrape of chairs against the floor and the occasional dry cough echoing in the tense air. The atmosphere was suffocating, pressing down on my chest with each passing second as we all waited for what we already feared. Then the door opened, and Director Campbell entered. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, but his face was drawn, heavy with the burden of his task. His eyes avoided ours as though meeting them would make his words unbearable. In his hands he carried a thick folder, which he placed on the table with a dull thud. When he began to speak, his voice was flat and mechanical, stripped of humanity, as if he were reading off financial statistics instead of announcing the fates of people who had given years of their lives to this company. "As you know, the company is undergoing restructuring," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. "Unfortunately, certain positions will be eliminated." He opened the folder and started reading the list. When my name, Henry Chaffee, echoed through the room, the world around me seemed to collapse. My ears rang, my throat tightened, and for a moment I could hardly breathe. It was as if the ground beneath me had given way, leaving me suspended in a void. Around me, the faces of colleagues blurred into indistinct shapes. After 12 years of devotion, after countless late nights spent finishing projects, after years of loyalty and pride in my work, I was dismissed with nothing more than a few cold words on a piece of paper. I rose quietly, my legs stiff, and walked back to my desk. On it lay the meager collection of items that represented my years at Exalon, a handful of faded family photographs, a chipped porcelain mug, and a few notebooks filled with cramped handwriting from long nights of troubleshooting and planning. I gathered them carefully, placing each into a cardboard box, a box that Doris, my longtime colleague, had silently fetched from the storage room. Her eyes were red, glistening as she set it down beside me, but she said nothing. A few co-workers came over and laid their hands briefly on my shoulder, their gestures wordless, but heavy with sympathy. No words were exchanged, and perhaps none were needed. The silence spoke louder than any hollow reassurance could. And so, after 12 years of loyalty, I carried my entire career in a small cardboard box, walking out of the building that had once felt like a second home but now seemed to expel me like a stranger. When I left the office, I had no idea where to go. The sky hung gray and heavy, the wind carrying brittle leaves that scraped and skittered across the pavement beneath my shoes. Clutching the small cardboard box that held the remnants of my 12 years at Exalon, I wandered aimlessly into the park. It felt less like I was carrying belongings and more like I was cradling a coffin of my past life. I drifted along the winding paths for hours. Around me, the world bustled with energy I no longer felt a part of. Joggers passed by with steady strides, earbuds in place, their faces focused on personal goals. Children shrieked with laughter as they chased one another across the grass. Couples sat entwined on benches, their voices bubbling with warmth and laughter. They all belonged to a vibrant world still in motion, while I trudged along its edges, a shadow no one cared to notice. People walked past me, speaking into their phones, laughing at private jokes, or rushing to their next appointment. Not a single glance fell my way. To them, I was nothing more than an old man clutching a battered cardboard box. To me, it felt as if I had become invisible, as though my very existence had lost its meaning in the grand story of life. Eventually, with nowhere else left to turn, my weary steps carried me back to Ethan's house. Each stride along the familiar road felt heavier than the last, my heart weighed down by humiliation and a bitter sense of helplessness. I dreaded the reception that awaited me, but I had no other refuge. When I stepped inside, the faint smell of food long gone, cold, lingered in the kitchen. Ethan sat at the table, his head bent low, absently turning a cup in his hands as if avoiding the truths neither of us wanted to voice. Across from him, Vanessa lifted her gaze to meet mine. Her eyes were sharp, her displeasure etched plainly across her face. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, a faint, dismissive huff escaping her lips. Her eyes flicked toward the box in my arms, the box that contained 12 years of my labor, and in her gaze, it was reduced to nothing more than a pile of clutter I had foolishly dragged back into their home. "I lost my job," I confessed at last, my voice dropping heavy and low, like a stone sinking into the silence of the kitchen. The bulb above the table buzzed faintly, its light casting tired yellow shadows over the chipped tiles. The air, already cold, thickened instantly, pressing against my chest until every breath felt like pulling gravel into my lungs. Ethan froze mid-motion. The cup he had been absent-mindedly turning in his hands suddenly stilled. For a second, his eyes lifted to mine, shock, then worry, flashing quick as lightning before he lowered them again, as though the sight of my defeat was too much to bear. His thumb rubbed against the rim of the mug, faster, harder, until I could see the whiteness in his knuckle. Vanessa, on the other hand, crossed her arms with deliberate sharpness. Her bracelets jingled as if announcing her verdict before she even spoke. A faint, disdainful curl formed at the corner of her lips as she tilted her head, eyes narrowing with judgment. When her voice came, it cracked through the stillness like a gavel striking down in court. "So what now? You can't pay rent anymore?" she demanded, her tone biting, as though I had just confessed to a crime, not a misfortune. "For a while, no," I admitted. The words dragged out of me, heavy as stones pried from the bottom of a well. "Well then," she said coldly, leaning back in her chair, a thin smile slicing across her face. "You'll have to leave. This isn't a nursing home, and it sure as hell isn't a charity." Ethan stirred. His chair scraped softly against the floor as he leaned forward. "Vanessa," he began, his voice fragile, barely more than a whisper. For a heartbeat, hope flickered in me, hope that he might finally stand between me and her cruelty. But then she turned. One sharp glance, like the edge of a knife, cut the rest of his words away. He swallowed them, lowering his gaze again. His lips parted once, as if to speak, then pressed tight in defeat. I watched my son shrink into the background, torn yet powerless, and I felt the ache of recognition, the same weakness in him that had haunted me for years. I drew in a long breath, steady, forcing myself not to flinch under Vanessa's cold gaze. My voice came calm, almost serene. "I understand. I'll leave by the end of the week." Her eyes glittered with cruel satisfaction. In her mind, she had won. She believed she had finally cornered the frail old man she had despised all along. But beneath my calm, deep within me, a quiet fire stirred not of rage, but of certainty. Let her believe she has triumphed. Soon enough, Vanessa will learn that the man she thinks she cast out still has a choice and a home of his own. Leaving my son's house turned out to be easier than I had feared, though not because it hurt less. I packed quietly, alone, in the dim light of my small rented room. The closet creaked when I opened it. My hands moved slowly over the worn clothes, folding each into the old scuffed suitcase that had seen better years. Its corners were frayed, its handle scarred, yet it still carried the stubborn strength to hold the pieces of my life. I slipped a few yellowed books into a cardboard box, pages smelling faintly of dust and nights once spent reading by lamplight. Then, carefully, almost reverently, I tucked in several faded photographs. My fingers lingered on one Ethan at 10 years old, grinning wide with 2 front teeth missing, holding a kite aloft in the park. The edges of the photo had curled, but the memory within was sharp, so sharp it stung. No one came to watch me leave. There were no goodbyes at the door, no polite words to soften the final click of the lock behind me. Only the hollow sound of the latch snapping into place, cold and final, like a judgment passed without appeal. The taxi waited at the curb, its headlights washing the wet pavement in pale light. I loaded my bags into the trunk and slid into the back seat. The driver, a weary-looking man with stubble shading his jaw, glanced at me through the mirror but asked no questions. He turned up the radio, a faint tune, some old ballad playing low and crackling, barely filling the silence. As the car pulled away, I allowed myself one last glance back. The kitchen window glowed faintly, the curtain swaying with Vanessa's shadow moving inside. Ethan's silhouette was absent. My chest tightened, and I exhaled heavily, turning my eyes forward, letting the stretch of road unravel like a long, dark ribbon before me. Streetlights swept over the taxi's hood one by one, their glow sliding across the glass, then vanishing into the night behind us. With every passing block, it felt as though I was shedding years of burden, the sharp words, the tense silences, the small humiliations that had defined my life beneath their roof. And yet, there was grief too. I felt the sting of loss, not for the house I left, but for the fragile hope that my son might one day have stood beside me. The ache lingered, pressing against my ribs, but alongside it grew something else, something fierce and sweet, a sense of liberation so raw it almost frightened me. By the time the taxi stopped in front of Margaret's Victorian house, dawn's first light was brushing the edges of the sky. I carried my bags up the stone steps, my legs trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer weight of change. The key turned in the lock. The door opened with a sigh, as though the house itself had been waiting for me. The wooden banister gleamed under my fingertips, smooth and welcoming. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my shoes, not in complaint but in greeting. I opened the tall windows, and a rush of air poured in. Sunlight broke across the walls, and with it came the scent of aged wood mingled with lilacs blooming outside. I drew in a steady breath, and something in me settled. For the first time in years, I was no longer dependent on tolerance or charity. No voice would shout behind me. No eyes would narrow in contempt. These halls were mine. This house was more than inheritance. It was sanctuary. It was not an ending. It was a beginning. The next morning, I did not call from home. I wanted certainty carved in stone, not just in the airwaves. So I made my way to the solicitor's office, a narrow brick building with polished brass letters that read, Prescott and Finch, Notaries and Solicitors. The scent of paper, wax, and polished wood greeted me as I stepped inside. Mr. Prescott himself ushered me into his office. A man of measured words and deliberate gestures, he adjusted his spectacles, spread the documents across his oak desk, and tapped one with his finger. "Mr. Henry," he said, his voice even, "everything is now finalized. The property is yours freehold, uncontested. No cousin, no distant relative, not even the cleverest lawyer could challenge it. You are, in every legal sense, the sole master of Margaret's estate." He turned a few more pages, pointing with precision. "You will, of course, have the routine obligations, property taxes, insurance, basic maintenance. Nothing unusual, nothing burdensome. But the important point is this: from here forward, no one but you decides what becomes of this house." That single sentence settled into me like an anchor. No one but you. I had not heard those words in years. For decades I had lived under the weight of compromise, bending beneath other people's voices, employers, landlords, Vanessa's sharp tongue in her household. But now, here in the quiet authority of that office, the truth became unshakable. I was the master of my own home. I signed the final papers with a steady hand, though inside my chest a storm of emotions roared: relief, disbelief, and an almost boyish thrill I hadn't felt since my youth. When I stepped out into the daylight, the air seemed clearer, brighter. The house was not just an inheritance. It was freedom, made tangible. That evening, shadows stretched long across the walls of the Victorian estate. I was still savoring the sensation of ownership when the telephone rang. The sound cut sharp through the hush, and I lifted the receiver. "Henry, dear," came the voice on the other end. "Vanessa." But gone was the commanding edge, the constant bite of criticism. Her voice poured through the line with syrupy sweetness, each word deliberately measured. It was the tone of a performer slipping into a new costume. "We heard the most wonderful news about Margaret's estate," she purred. "A friend of a friend spotted you near Prescott's office, and well, word travels quickly, doesn't it? Congratulations are certainly in order. We simply must celebrate together." I could almost see her painted smile, lips stretched too wide, eyes calculating behind the mask of warmth. A dry laugh tugged at the corner of my mouth. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone calm and deliberate. "Come for dinner tomorrow evening. Bring Ethan with you. Tomorrow night will be special." When I hung up the receiver, I let my hand rest on the cool metal for a long moment. The house around me was silent, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt charged, alive, waiting. This dinner would not be a mere celebration. It would be a stage, and at last, the balance of power would shift. At exactly 7 o'clock, the chime of the doorbell rang out, deep and resonant, echoing through the wide halls of the Victorian home like a toll of ceremony. I paused for a breath, smoothing the front of my jacket, and walked unhurriedly toward the entrance. The heavy brass handle felt cool beneath my palm as I drew open the door. On the porch stood Ethan and Vanessa. They had dressed far more formally than the evening warranted, Ethan in a stiff suit that seemed to weigh on his shoulders, Vanessa shimmering in a dark dress that caught the porch light, her hair lacquered into perfect waves. For a moment, I wondered if they thought they were arriving at a gala or a negotiation, rather than a family dinner. "Dad, this place is incredible," Ethan murmured as he stepped across the threshold. His eyes swept upward, catching the glow of the chandelier in the foyer, the polished banister curving like a ribbon of mahogany. His voice carried genuine awe, but I saw something else flicker beneath a pinch of envy, quick and sharp, like the shadow of a storm cloud darting across a bright sky. Vanessa followed a step behind, her heels striking against the gleaming floorboards with a rhythm that sounded too sharp, too claiming. Her gaze moved everywhere at once. The ornate crown moldings, the oil portraits staring solemnly from the walls, the cut crystal chandelier overhead blazing with golden light. I noticed the way her eyes widened slightly, pupils dilating as though she were already imagining each piece in her possession. Her hand reached out almost unconsciously, fingertips gliding along the polished surface of a mahogany side table. She let them linger there, stroking the wood grain with the intimacy of someone caressing a prize. The gesture was small, but I caught it, a telltale claim disguised as admiration. "How many rooms does it have?" she asked finally, her voice light but trembling with a poorly concealed excitement. Her eyes glittered the way a child's might in a candy store, wide and hungry, unable to decide where to look first. 7 bedrooms, I replied, letting my tone remain calm, deliberate. 4 bathrooms. Her breath hitched. I let the pause stretch, savoring the way anticipation settled over her, then added, "And a library with more than 3,000 books." Vanessa's head snapped toward me, her eyes gleaming. 3,000? "Precisely 3,722, I corrected gently, a small smile tugging at the corner of my lips. I counted them myself. The words hung between us, not casual conversation but deliberate weight, reminding her that this was not hearsay, not some story of inheritance to be twisted. It was fact, counted, measured, owned. I watched as her lips parted in astonishment, the hunger in her expression deepening into something almost feverish. Ethan's gaze darted to her and then back to me, his brow knitting slightly, as though he too recognized the look in her eyes but dared not speak it aloud. And in that moment, I realized with a quiet certainty, the house had already begun to intoxicate her. The polished wood, the glow of the chandelier, the endless rows of books, it was more than she could resist. She wasn't merely impressed, she was possessed by the idea of it. I stood still in the doorway of my own home, a faint smile hidden in the corner of my thoughts. Let her look, let her covet. Tonight, she would discover that possession and power were not the same thing. "And you managed to get all of this without lifting a finger?" Vanessa asked, her voice pitched high, coated with a sugary sweetness that barely hid the envy underneath. Her eyes glistened as they swept across the chandelier, the polished wood, the fine china laid out on the table. I raised my wine glass, swirling it slowly, letting the moment breathe before replying. "Why not? I don't believe an inheritance is something one has to earn, Vanessa. Margaret was my father's last living relative. Clearly she believed this home should stay within the family." "But you never mentioned her," Vanessa pressed, her tone sharp despite the smile curling on her lips. "Not once did you speak of having such a wealthy connection." "We weren't close," I said with a shrug, leading them from the library into the dining room. Now, enough of that. Dinner is nearly ready. At the table, Vanessa's restless eyes never stopped moving. Her fingers tapped lightly on the polished oak as though she were calculating the value of everything around her. The difference was striking. Back in Delmare, I was invisible to her, barely worth a glance. Yet here, in this house, every word I spoke she received as though it were pure gold, her lips stretching into a smile that was almost rehearsed. "Henry," she murmured between sips of wine, her gaze sweeping the high ceiling as though picturing herself in command of it. "You really should tell me how you plan to arrange the house. Perhaps you'd like some guidance with the interior design. I have a few marvelous ideas." I ladled soup into her bowl with deliberate calm. "Thank you, Vanessa, but I'm quite satisfied with how things are. Margaret had exquisite taste." Of course, she nodded quickly, feigning agreement. "I only thought you might want to add a personal touch. But you're right, it's beautiful just as at Island." Across from us, Ethan sat mostly in silence. His eyes darted back and forth between me and his wife, the way a child might watch two adults play a game he couldn't quite understand. At last, he spoke, his voice heavy with disappointment and reproach. "Dad, why didn't you tell me about the inheritance? I didn't even know you had an aunt." I set my spoon down and looked directly at him. "I only learned of it myself shortly before I lost my job. I wanted time to understand it fully before sharing the news." "But you could have told me when you left our house," he said, his tone tightening. "Instead, you let us think you had nowhere else to go." "Nowhere else to go?" I raised an eyebrow, my gaze steady. "Did you truly believe that, Ethan? Or was that an idea whispered into your ear by Vanessa?" Vanessa stiffened, her smile freezing for a heartbeat before she quickly masked it with a syrupy laugh. "Henry, there's no need to dig up the past. What matters is that you have this wonderful home now. We can start fresh, can't we?" "Start fresh?" I repeated, leaning forward, meeting her gaze directly. "And precisely what are you proposing, Vanessa?" She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, caught off guard by my bluntness. "Well, perhaps we could see each other more often. This house is far too large for one person. Surely there's room for guests. You might even enjoy having us here on weekends, the way it used to be." 4 bedrooms, I confirmed evenly. "Plenty of space for guests." Her face brightened at once, hope and greed mingling in her eyes. "You see, we could visit, help you keep the place tidy. I know a wonderful cleaning service that could maintain the house regularly. And we could cook for you, Dad," Ethan added, his eyes softening as he leaned forward. "Remember how Mom and I used to cook for you on Sundays when I was little?" A genuine smile tugged at my lips as I looked at him, the one person at the table whose motives I did not doubt. "I remember, son. Those were good days." Dinner lingered on, each course cloaked in polite conversation, but with every passing minute it became painfully clear that Vanessa's interest lay not in mending any bond with me, but in fastening her grip on the house and the fortune tied to it. She asked about the cost of maintaining a mansion of this size, speculated whether I planned to modernize certain rooms, and even offered, with mock humility, to assist me in selecting better furnishings. After dessert, I guided them into the living room. The crystal chandelier above cast fractured beams of light across the glass-topped table, its brilliance cold, almost clinical. I poured fresh coffee, the rich aroma drifting between us, though beneath it hung a silence heavy with unspoken motives. The air itself seemed thickened, waiting. Vanessa positioned herself closer to me on the sofa than she had ever dared before. She leaned slightly forward, her voice soft, her manicured hands resting delicately on her lap, as though to advertise a gentleness she did not possess. "Henry, I really must apologize again for how I treated you," she murmured, her tone dripping with contrition so carefully rehearsed that, had I not known better, I might have believed it. I was confused, overwhelmed by financial pressures. Life in Delmare is so expensive now, but that's no excuse. The things I said were cruel, and I deeply regret them. I studied her face, the same face that only a week ago had hardened into ice as she cast me out of Ethan's house without hesitation. That woman's voice had cracked like a whip, condemning me as a burden. Now, the same mouth spun sugar, wrapped in the disguise of remorse. What had changed? Nothing but this. She had discovered the truth about my inheritance. "I appreciate the apology, Vanessa," I said evenly, though my voice carried a subtle edge. "But I confess, I'm curious. What exactly brought about this change of heart?" For a flicker of a moment, her composure slipped. Then, with a practiced smile, she recovered. "It isn't you, Henry. It's the circumstances. I realize I acted rashly, without thinking of the consequences. You are family, and family should stand by one another." "Yes," I nodded slowly. "Family should stand by one another even when one member loses his job and can no longer pay rent." Color flared across her cheeks, but she kept the smile plastered on her lips. "I was wrong, Henry, truly wrong, and I only hope you'll forgive me." From across the room, Ethan's face softened with visible relief. He seemed almost grateful, perhaps imagining that the storm had passed, that reconciliation had finally come. My son had always yearned for peace, even if it meant settling for the fragile illusion of it. "Vanessa, do you know what I've realized?" I said at last, rising from the sofa and pacing toward the window. My voice deepened with each step. "I've thought long and hard about everything that's passed between us, and I've concluded that the words you spoke before those words that cut so deeply were the truest you've ever spoken. You believe a man without money is not deserving of respect nor of care." Her head shook quickly, panic edging into her tone. "No, Henry, you're mistaken. I never believed that." I turned sharply, my eyes boring into hers. "No money, no place here." I repeated her very words, each syllable sharp as a blade. "That's what you said, and in that moment, Vanessa, you were entirely sincere." "Dad, please," Ethan interjected, rising to his feet, his voice trembling with desperation. "Don't drag this out any further. Vanessa has apologized. I think we should all just move on." His eyes glistened with exhaustion, as though he wanted nothing more than to drape a thin veil of harmony over the raw wound between us. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man who still shrank from defending me against his wife's cruelty. My voice softened, though my resolve did not. "You're right, son. We can move on. But before we do, there's something I need to make absolutely clear." I returned to the armchair opposite Vanessa and slowly drew from my coat pocket a thick bundle of documents, bound neatly with a clip. The faint rustle of the papers seemed to echo like the opening gavel of a courtroom. I set them on the table with deliberate weight. "Not after I've seen how quickly your contempt could be traded for false concern." I drew the thick folder closer, the brass clip at its spine groaning faintly as I pried it open. The papers inside were crisp, their edges sharp against the glow of the chandelier, and the black ink of my signature gleamed under the light like iron freshly forged. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath as I straightened the pages before me. "In this first version of my will," I said, my voice steady and deliberate, "I have decided that the majority of my estate will be placed into a fund supporting the homeless elderly. Because I know what it feels like to be cast aside, to be thrown into the street by someone who should have cared. And I refuse to let my legacy become the root of greed, bitterness, or division within this family." The words hung in the air like the toll of a heavy bell. Vanessa's painted smile shattered. For a split second, she looked carved from stone, then her lips twisted, fury twitching across her features as if a mask had been ripped away. "You're doing this to punish me," she screeched, her shrill tone slicing through the silence. "This is revenge for one careless remark I made in anger." I shook my head slowly, the motion deliberate, my eyes locked onto hers. "No, Vanessa, I'm doing this because it is right. I will not allow my home, or my savings, to become weapons in your hands. I know too well what it feels like to be dismissed, humiliated, treated as worthless, and I will not let that cycle continue." Her fury crumbled into desperation. She lifted her hands as if words alone could tether me back. "What if we saw each other more often? What if you moved back in with us, or we came here with you? We could be a happy family, Henry. Please, rewrite the will. We can start fresh. I leaned back in my chair, watching her the way one studies an actress repeating the same tired lines. My voice hardened, the warmth stripped away. No, not after I've seen how quickly contempt can turn into counterfeit concern. You haven't changed out of regret, Vanessa. You've changed because of money. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the polished wood, her face red with rage. It isn't fair. You can't judge me for one mistake. One mistake? I rose slowly, the folder still open in my hand. It was not one, Vanessa. It was a year and a half of contempt, of cold shoulders and cutting words. It was how you treated me when you believed I was poor, helpless. And now, the moment you learn I've inherited a fortune, your cruelty evaporates, and suddenly you speak of love and family. That is not change. That is calculation. Ethan sat frozen, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. His eyes darted between us, anguish etched into his features. Inwardly, I could almost feel his thoughts. How did it come to this? How did my home become a battlefield? He pressed his lips together until they thinned into a pale line, too torn to speak. I softened my tone as I turned toward him. Son, I can offer a compromise. You can always visit me. I would welcome that. But I will never again live under the weight of your wife's grudging charity. Ethan lifted his head, something glimmering in his eyes, a fragile spark of resolve. His voice trembled, but the words carried weight. I understand, Dad, and I respect your decision. It's your money, your house. You have every right to use it as you see fit. Vanessa spun toward him, her fury snapping back. You can't be serious, Ethan. This was supposed to be our inheritance, our future. But Ethan's jaw set. For the first time, his gaze didn't waver. No, Vanessa, this is my father's inheritance, his decision, and none of us has the right to dictate what he does with it. I could see the torment in my son's eyes, a storm raging just beneath the surface. His fingers twitched against the tablecloth as if he longed to reach for me, but fear chained his hand in place. If I agree with him, I betray her. If I side with her, I betray him. Am I destined to lose either way? I can offer a compromise, I said at last, cutting through the tension. My tone softened, though it carried an iron edge beneath. We can still see each other, Ethan. You are always welcome here. But I will never return to the old arrangement living under your roof, dependent on your wife's reluctant charity. I understand, Dad, Ethan whispered, his gaze sliding away from Vanessa's piercing stare. There was shame in his eyes, but also a glimmer of respect. And I respect your decision about the inheritance. It's your money, your house, and you have every right to decide what happens to it. Vanessa's mask shattered completely. She whirled toward him, her voice jagged. You can't be serious. This was supposed to be our inheritance, our future. This is my father's inheritance, Vanessa, Ethan answered, and for the first time his voice carried steel. And he doesn't owe it to us, not a single penny. Her fists clenched, nails biting into her palms until her knuckles whitened. Ethan, how can you say that? The room sank into a suffocating silence. Only the steady tick of the grandfather clock dared to speak, each sound hammering tension deeper into the walls. Ethan's breath came shallow, his eyes squeezing shut. God, why does every word feel like choosing sides with a knife pressed to my chest? He drew a long, ragged breath. When he opened his eyes again, they shimmered with conflict. Because it's the truth, he admitted, hoarse. But that doesn't make it any easier. Dad, what you're really doing is forcing me to choose between my wife and the inheritance. I folded my arms, my voice calm but unyielding. No, Ethan, I am not the one forcing this choice. Circumstance Island, and that is why I added a condition to my will, a condition both of you need to hear. I let the silence thicken before I spoke again. My breath came slow, deliberate. Because I can see how completely Vanessa's shadow has fallen over you. You've grown timid. Ethan lost the courage to stand tall, to defend what is right. And I will not let my estate become another chain tightening around your marriage. That is why I have decided to leave this house to a fund for the homeless elderly men and women who ask for nothing more than a roof to shelter their final years. The folder remained open on the table, the pages catching the candlelight, each signature reflecting back at me like a seal of judgment. The clock ticked louder, merciless, every beat striking like a hammer. Vanessa's complexion drained, then flushed crimson. Her hands clutched the strap of her handbag until her knuckles blanched, her nails pressing into her skin. "You can't do this!" she shrieked, voice cracking. "This house belongs to the family." "It belongs to me," I said firmly, raising my chin. My words rang with authority, filling the room. "And I will decide where it goes, to those who truly need it, not as a prize for anyone's greed." Across the table, Ethan buried his face in his hands. His fingers dug into his hair, shoulders trembling. Inside, I knew his thoughts tore at him. He's right. I've let her control everything. But why does it hurt so much to hear it said aloud? Why do I feel like a child caught between parents again? "Dad," his voice cracked, muffled against his palms. "This feels like a blade cutting straight through us. It's tearing this family apart." "No, my son," I replied softly, sorrow wrapping around each word. "It is not my decision that's tearing us apart. It is the truth, finally dragged into the light." Vanessa shot to her feet, her chair shrieking across the floor. She snatched her handbag, her heels hammering a furious rhythm as she stormed toward the door. The slam reverberated through the mansion like a gunshot, echoing long after she was gone. Ethan hesitated, sagging under the weight of loyalty and shame. Then, with reluctant steps, he followed, his figure swallowed by the darkness of the hallway. And I remained alone, the vast silence pressing in. Only the hollow echo of my own breathing lingered, and the knowledge that the house, Margaret's house, now mine, was both sanctuary and solitary fortress. I moved slowly toward the tall window, my hand brushing against the heavy curtain. The fabric stirred faintly as the night breeze seeped through the cracks of the old frame. Beyond the glass, the dim orange glow of the street lamp cast long shadows across the driveway. There, I saw Ethan trudging toward the car, his shoulders hunched low. It was not the weight of his coat that bent him, but the invisible burden of years, years of silence, of concessions, of living under the shadow of another's will. Beside him, Vanessa's arms slashed the air in furious arcs. Even though I could not hear her words, I knew their rhythm sharp, relentless, cruel. Her movements were like whips, cutting into him again and again, leaving invisible welts long before he reached the car. For one brief second, Ethan hesitated, his hand resting on the door handle as if searching for strength to resist. But her unyielding barrage drove him inside, and with a harsh sweep of headlights, the car rolled away, swallowed by the night. I remained at the window, longer than I should have. Behind me, the chandelier burned low, stretching my shadow across the tiled floor. It warped and twisted grotesquely, an image of age and frailty mocking me in silence. My chest felt heavy, each breath dragging as though the very walls, the very furniture of the house, exhaled their despair into me. This was not the life I had once pictured. I had dreamed of peace in my final years, mornings with the newspaper and a steaming cup of tea, afternoons spent tending roses and tomatoes under the quiet sun, evenings filled with the high laughter of grandchildren darting through hallways. I imagined bedtime stories told in a gentle voice, watching little eyes droop with comfort as my words became their bridge to dreams. But instead of roses, I had thorns. Instead of laughter, I had accusations. My home was not a sanctuary, but a battlefield where kinship turned into weapons and words into bullets that sought the heart. That night, sleep would not come. I lay in the wide bed, its emptiness echoing like a cavern. I turned from one side to the other, but the silence pressed closer, gnawing at me. Whenever my eyes shut, Ethan's face reappeared, those sorrowful eyes, lips trembling on the edge of speech, yet swallowing everything back. His torment was a blade slicing into me, deeper each time, keeping me chained to wakefulness. At one point, I pushed myself upright, staring at the faint glow of the hallway lamp spilling through the crack beneath the bedroom door. The grandfather clock downstairs marked each passing second with a relentless tick, each strike pounding against my ribs like a reminder. Time is slipping, time does not wait. I felt every beat like a hammer forging the shape of my own loneliness. The morning came at last. Sunlight spilled through the high windows, painting the floor with golden streaks, but its brightness could not penetrate the heaviness within me. I wandered the house aimlessly, running my fingers along the polished banister, pausing at doorways where I tried to summon laughter that had never been. In the library, I traced the spines of books, but the words blurred. In the dining room, I saw only an empty chair across from me, the space where reconciliation still felt possible, yet painfully distant. Then, near noon, the silence cracked. The sharp ring of the telephone pierced the air like an alarm bell. My heart clenched before my hand even reached the receiver. When I lifted it, I heard Ethan's voice low, hoarse, hesitant. Each syllable dragged itself forward, as though breaking through invisible chains. "Dad, could we meet? Just the two of us. No one else." For a moment, I froze, my throat tight. Then, my reply came soft but steady, drawn from a place of both hope and fear. "Of course, son. Anytime you wish." On the line came his sigh, long and trembling, carrying exhaustion but also a fragile thread of relief. His next words cracked, brittle, almost breaking. "Tomorrow, 7 o'clock, just like tonight, but this time, only the two of us." The line went dead with a quiet click, but I remained standing there, the receiver still pressed to my ear, staring into nothing. My heart thudded slowly, heavily, as if preparing me for something inevitable. I knew, then, that this second dinner would not be about food, or politeness, or ceremony. It would not be about the candles or the polished silver. It would be about truth, raw, undeniable truth. A father and son, reaching for each other across years of silence, trying to find what had been broken before time ran out. I awoke early the next morning, long before the hour of our planned dinner. The house was cavernous, and its silence was no longer peaceful but oppressive, echoing with fragments of last night's confrontation. I could almost hear them still, Vanessa's shrill voice, Ethan's trembling defiance, my own words falling heavy like stones into the room. Every corner seemed to hold a shadow of raised voices. Every surface bore the weight of what had been spoken. I spent the entire day preparing, each motion slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. I polished the silverware until it gleamed, its reflection throwing tiny sparks of light across the table. I smoothed the tablecloth again and again until not a wrinkle remained. I set the candles in the center and lit them early, their flames bending softly in the air, casting a warm glow meant to soften the edges of the night. This was not a table set for guests, not for a stranger or dignitary, but for my son, the child I had once carried on my shoulders, the boy who once ran to me with scraped knees, demanding comfort and laughter. At precisely 7, the chime of the doorbell rang. This time, Ethan stood alone on the front steps. The street lamp cast his shadow long across the stones, and though his face was etched with weariness, his eyes held a fragile spark, the faint light of hope flickering against despair. "Dad," he said quietly, almost reverently, when I opened the door, "thank you for inviting me." We sat at the long table. At first, only the clink of utensils against porcelain broke the silence. Each sound rang sharp, almost accusing, echoing across the wide room. But unlike the night before, the silence carried no hostility. It was heavy, yes, but it was the heaviness of two souls searching for a bridge across a gulf, not the void of open war. At last, Ethan let out a long, shaky breath. His hands trembled slightly on the edge of his plate as his voice cracked. "Dad, I'm sorry. Sorry for everything that happened last night." I looked at him, not just the grown man seated across from me, but the little boy I once tucked into bed, the child whose laughter once filled my evenings. My chest tightened, and I nodded slowly. "I know, son. I know it isn't easy for you." His shoulders sagged. His eyes dropped to his plate, staring at the untouched food. "Vanessa can be difficult," he murmured, as though afraid to speak the truth too loudly. "But she's still my wife. I feel trapped between you both. I don't want to lose you, Dad, but I also can't turn my back on her." I set my fork down, the sound echoing faintly. "I understand," I said gently. "And I don't want you to feel forced to choose. That's why I made the decision about the inheritance to free you from that burden." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as though the words themselves were difficult to keep down. "But it still hurts," he whispered. "To think that everything you built, every brick, every wall of this house, won't remain in the family." I reached across the table, my hand brushing against the stem of my glass before resting midway. I met his eyes. "Family isn't bricks and money, Ethan. It's love, it's respect, it's walking side by side even when the road is difficult. That's what we lost along the way." For a long moment, silence stretched. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked steadily, each sound cutting through the air like a pulse. The candle flames swayed slightly, their glow painting his face in shifting gold. His lips quivered as though words were trapped there, pressing against the edge of release. Then, slowly, he nodded. His eyes shimmered with unspoken emotion. "Maybe you're right, Dad. But tonight, let's not talk about money anymore. Let's just share this meal as father and son." I felt my throat tighten, but I forced a smile, soft and true, and in that moment, with the flames flickering, the clock ticking, and silence thick but no longer hostile, the room itself felt less empty, as though the old house was holding its breath, quietly hoping that what was once fractured might, at last, begin to mend. Of course, Vanessa blurted out, her nods so quick and mechanical that they seemed rehearsed. Her crimson nails tapped against the rim of her wineglass, faster and faster, until the surface of the liquid quivered and spilled in a thin line down the stem. She didn't notice. Or perhaps she did, but pretended not to. "I only thought you might want to add a little personal touch of your own," she went on, her voice pitched higher than usual, the strain audible beneath the veneer of charm. "But you're right. It really is beautiful as it island." Across from her, Ethan sat stiffly, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the chandelier above pressed down upon him. His eyes darted helplessly around the table, like a trapped bird searching for a way out. He looked at me, then at her, then down at the empty patch of polished wood before him, as if an answer might miraculously rise up from the grain. At last, his voice broke through the charged silence, cracking slightly under its own weight. "Dad, why didn't you tell me about the inheritance? I didn't even know you had an aunt." His tone was caught between bewilderment and quiet accusation, as though he needed to believe I had withheld something rather than face how little he had asked. I placed my spoon carefully onto the saucer, the faint clink echoing in the cavernous room. My gaze found his, steady and deliberate. "I only learned of it myself shortly before losing my job," I answered, "and I wanted to understand every detail before I shared the news. But you could have told me when you packed your things and left our house." His fingers drummed against the table, each tap sharper than the last, betraying the anger he tried to swallow. "Instead, you let us believe you had nowhere else to go." I let his words hang between us like smoke. Then I leaned back, my brow lifting, my voice lowering into something edged and cold. "Nowhere else to go," I repeated, tasting the phrase as though it were poison. "Do you really believe that, Ethan? Or was that idea whispered into your ear, again and again, by Vanessa?" At once, Vanessa stiffened. Her spine turned rigid, her shoulders locked in place. For the briefest of moments, her mask slipped, her lips pressed thin, her jaw tight with offense. But then she drew a long, shallow breath, forcing her features into the old familiar smile. Her hand tightened around her napkin, hiding the tremor in her fingers. "Henry," she said sweetly, each syllable lacquered with practiced gentleness, "let's not dredge up the past. What matters now is that you have this wonderful house. We can start fresh." "Start fresh?" I echoed, my body leaning forward, my eyes pinning hers. My tone carried no softness, only challenge. "And what exactly do you mean by that, Vanessa?" She shifted uneasily in her chair. For once, the smooth, rehearsed words did not come easily. Her voice faltered, then picked itself up again. "Well, I thought we could see each other more often. Perhaps you'd enjoy staying with us again. Like before." Or we could come here on weekends. This house is so large, surely there are rooms for guests. 4 bedrooms, I replied evenly, letting the silence hang for a beat before adding, plenty for guests. Her face brightened, hope flaring instantly. She leaned forward, her words spilling quicker now, desperate to seize momentum. You see, we could visit, help you keep the place in order. I even know an excellent cleaning service. They'd make sure everything sparkles. And cook for you too, Dad, Ethan added, his voice suddenly gentler, his eyes softening as a memory surfaced, his lips curved with something genuine, untouched by calculation. Do you remember? Back when I was little, Mom and I would make chicken soup on Sundays. She would laugh, I'd be clumsy with the vegetables, and you'd sit on the porch waiting for the smell to drift through the house. The memory hit me like sunlight piercing heavy clouds. A smile broke across my face, one I could not suppress, one I reserved only for him. In that moment, I did not see a grown man torn between loyalties. I saw the boy who once came running with scraped knees, the boy whose laughter once filled these walls. Yes, I remember, son, I said softly, my voice touched with warmth. Those were the simplest and most beautiful of days, days when family truly felt like family. For a fleeting moment, as candlelight shimmered and flickered across our faces, it was as though time bent backwards. The air grew lighter, the shadows retreating, and I felt a fragile thread weaving itself again between father and son. But behind that fragile warmth lingered another truth. Greed and memory cannot occupy the same table forever. Son, I am not trying to start a quarrel, I said, lifting my hand slightly, palm open, as though I could press the air itself into calmness. My voice carried both gravity and restraint, a steady current beneath the storm. All I want is clarity. I want every one of us to be honest with ourselves and with each other. Ethan gave a faint nod, but his eyes were still clouded, like a lake muddied by unseen currents. Behind the silence in his gaze I sensed hesitation, shame, and a host of questions he could not yet voice. His lips parted, then closed again, as if he feared that whatever he might say would tip the fragile balance of the room. Honesty, Vanessa muttered, almost too softly, though the bitterness curled around her words like smoke. Her fingers twisted the linen napkin into a rope so tight it might have snapped. A brittle smile trembled on her lips, more grimace than grace. And what good is honesty, Henry, if all it leaves us with is bitterness and regret? I turned to her, locking my gaze with hers, my tone sharp but unwavering. Better to taste the bitterness of freedom, I said, my words cutting through the stale air, than to swallow sweetness wrapped in chains. The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to have substance. The tick of the grandfather clock grew metallic, each strike a hammer on iron, reverberating in the marrow of our bones. Ethan looked down at his hands, Vanessa looked away, and for a moment it felt as if each of us had retreated to a prison cell built of our own thoughts. At last, I pushed back my chair. The wooden legs shrieked against the floor, startling in the suffocating stillness. I rose slowly, each step deliberate, and crossed to my desk at the far side of the room. Upon its polished surface lay a folder, arranged with meticulous care. The lamplight glanced across its edges, catching on the embossed seal and the thick paper beneath, making the documents gleam as though they contained something far more dangerous than ink. Resting my hand firmly on the folder, I turned back to them. My shadow stretched long across the carpet, splitting the room in two. Yesterday, I said evenly, my voice steady, I showed you the documents you expected to see. But tonight, I let the words hang, heavy and unresolved. There is another matter, something none of you anticipated. Both their heads snapped up. Vanessa's eyes widened, suspicion flashing like steel. Ethan's breath quickened, his chest rising and falling as though he sensed the floor shifting beneath him. I could almost hear the stutter of their hearts in the silence. The surprise was about to unfold. I drew the folder from the desk drawer, the rustle of thick paper tearing into the tense quiet like a blade through silk. Slowly, deliberately, I placed it on the dining table before me. My fingers slid across the crisp edges, and I turned a few pages. the lamplight glinting off the signatures that sealed my authority. My eyes, however, never left Ethan. According to this addendum, I began, my voice steady, resonant, almost ceremonial in the stillness. The inheritance may remain in this family, but only under one condition. I let the pause linger, my gaze fixed on my son. Ethan, you must choose your own path in life. Not one carved out of fear, not one dictated by another's hand, not even Vanessa's. It must be your choice, and yours alone. The words hit him like a physical blow. Ethan froze, his face draining of color, lips quivering but refusing to part. His hands, which had been lying loosely on the table, clenched until his knuckles blanched white. For a moment, his throat worked soundlessly, as though his voice had been strangled before it could escape. I could almost hear the battle raging inside him, loyalty and love against pride and independence, a war he had avoided for too long. Suddenly, Vanessa erupted. She sprang to her feet, the chair screeching across the polished floor, the wine glass rattling violently in its saucer until crimson liquid trembled on the verge of spilling. "This is manipulation!" she shrieked, her eyes blazing. "You're trying to tear my husband away from me!" "No." I cut in sharply, my tone deep and immovable as granite. My hand pressed firmly atop the folder, pinning the papers as though sealing the words themselves. I am tearing nothing apart. I am giving my son back the freedom he has long lost. If he values this inheritance, then he must also value his independence and his integrity. Without those, this house and this fortune mean nothing. They will go instead to those who need them most, people who will not squander them in chains of deceit. With deliberate care, I flattened the papers with the palm of my hand, then released them. The thud as they settled onto the wood echoed like a judge's gavel striking the end of a trial. My gaze locked onto Ethan, hard and unblinking. The air between us vibrated, the silence alive with tension. Ethan's eyes darted from me to Vanessa and back again, his breath shallow, his chest rising in quick bursts. I could see it the moment he realized the burden was no longer shared. It rested squarely on his shoulders. "So now," I said, my voice low, deliberate, final, "the choice is yours, Ethan, and yours alone." Vanessa's face drained of all color as Henry's words struck her like a verdict. Her breath came out shallow, quick, and uneven, as though the very air had turned poisonous. In desperation, she lurched forward across the polished table, her cold fingers clawing at Ethan's hand like a drowning woman clutching at the last rope left in the storm. But Ethan recoiled, jerking his hand away with a finality so sharp it felt like steel snapping. His fingers trembled slightly as they withdrew, but his eyes flickered with something new, something alive, as though an invisible lock had finally been broken. "Ethan, don't listen to him." Vanessa's voice cracked in panic, pitched high, frantic. "He's twisting everything, trying to paint me as the villain." The words rushed out too fast, too desperate, betraying the fear gnawing at her core. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan rose from his chair. The scrape of wood against wood shrieked through the tense silence, slicing into the air like a blade dragged across stone. His face was pale, drawn taut by strain, yet in his eyes burned a fire I had not seen in years, a raw blaze that consumed the last remnants of his passivity. His chest rose and fell in deep, shaky breaths. His hand hovered in the air for a moment, uncertain, before curling into a fist at his side. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, resonant, each word landing like a hammer striking stone. "No, Vanessa, he's not twisting anything." A thick silence pressed against the walls. Even the grandfather clock seemed to hesitate before its next tick. Ethan's words hung there, vibrating in the stillness, before he drew in another sharp breath and pressed on. "Deep down, I've known this truth for years." His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "You've bound me with your control, humiliated my father with your disdain, and poisoned this family drop by drop with your greed until it rotted from within." Vanessa's eyes widened, wild with disbelief. She staggered back a step, her chest heaving, her lips curling into a scream that splintered under its own force. "You dare!" she shrieked, but the sound cracked mid-syllable, splintering like shattered glass. Her trembling hands lifted helplessly, hovering between clawing at the air or covering her face, not knowing whether to attack or to shield. Ethan's hands were trembling now too, but not with fear, with release, with fury years in the making. He pressed his palm flat on the table, steadying himself as his voice cut through again, sharp, merciless, unrelenting. "For years," he said, his tone vibrating with suppressed rage, "every decision, every word you uttered was designed to manipulate, to make sure that in the end you always got what you wanted." He paused, his lips quivering. A jagged breath left him, and for a heartbeat his voice faltered. His eyes flicked toward me, then back to Vanessa, before hardening again with a clarity that could not be shaken. "And he swallowed, fists clenching tight. "I stood by, blind, cowardly, pretending not to see while you turned me into nothing but a puppet in my own marriage." The words fell heavy, like stones dropped into deep water, each syllable sending ripples of silence across the room. Vanessa's breath came in ragged bursts. Ethan's shoulders trembled, and even I sat frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs. The air itself thickened, oppressive and dense, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The truth was no longer whispered, no longer denied. It had been spoken aloud, raw and unguarded, and once spoken, it could not be buried again. "I will file for divorce," Ethan finally declared. Each word dropped heavy into the room, sharp and irreversible, slicing through the thick air like a blade honed by years of silence. His voice trembled, but in his eyes burned a fire I had not seen since he was a boy, a fire that could not be mistaken for anything but resolve. Vanessa's jaw slackened. For a moment she seemed suspended in disbelief, her face blanching as though lightning had struck her straight through the chest. Her lips quivered with fragments of words, stammered protests that refused to take shape. Then, with a strangled gasp, she spun on her heels. The sharp staccato of her stilettos hammered against the floor, a frantic rhythm of fury and fear, until the door slammed behind her with such force that the walls trembled. The echo rang through the hall like a funeral bell, announcing the end of an era. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan collapsed into the nearest chair, his entire body folding inward, drained of every ounce of strength. His broad shoulders shook, his hands pressed against his face, muffling sobs that escaped raw and unguarded, the kind of tears only shed when the soul finally admits both its pain and its freedom. I stepped forward. My hand, though trembling, found the weight of his shoulder and rested there firmly. My voice, low but steady, carried the gravity of a father's pride. "I am proud of you, Ethan. It takes extraordinary courage to break free from chains you didn't even know had bound you for so long." Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes were red, swollen, glistening with tears clinging to the edge, threatening to fall. Yet behind that grief, behind the wreckage of what he had just torn apart, shimmered something fragile but undeniable gratitude, and the first flicker of hope. I only hope it's not too late to fix what's been broken between us." "It is never too late," I reassured him, my voice soft but resolute. "From now on, we rebuild together." The weeks that followed unfolded like a montage of battle and rebirth. Vanessa fought like a cornered animal. She filed petitions laced with venom, spreading wild lies about Ethan's temper. She alternated between threats, promising to ruin him financially, and pitiful pleading, sobbing outside the courthouse steps as though the world had conspired against her. Letters arrived in thick envelopes, full of accusations and demands. Phone calls came in at odd hours, her voice switching from ice to honey within a single breath. Yet none of it moved Ethan. With every passing day, he stood straighter, his voice steadier, his resolve no longer bleeding away beneath her manipulations. And as Vanessa's grip weakened, something else quietly took root. Life began to feel different, lighter. The Victorian estate, once echoing like a hollow fortress, slowly warmed into a home of belonging. In the mornings, Ethan and I took breakfast together on the wide veranda. The rising sun painted the garden gold while steam curled from our mugs of coffee. We spoke not of money or inheritance, but of books, of memories, of plans for the days ahead. Some afternoons I found solace in the soil, my hands busy among the roses Margaret had once planted. Kneeling in the dirt, I felt the ache in my knees, but also a satisfaction I had long forgotten. Each weed pulled was like stripping away a shadow from the past. Each blossom that opened reminded me that beauty returns after even the harshest winters. Ethan, too, carved out his place in the house. He chose the small sunroom at the back, where light poured in through tall windows. With quiet determination, he set up a modest desk, arranging pens, papers, and his laptop. "My own corner," he said with a half-smile, as if reclaiming more than just physical space. Watching him there, focused, steady, I felt a flicker of peace spread through me. Evenings often ended in simple ways: a shared meal cooked without criticism, the sound of laughter slipping through the halls, or the calm murmur of classical music filling the rooms without fear of being silenced. Footsteps no longer echoed hollowly across the floors. They carried rhythm now, the cadence of renewal. The old Victorian estate was no longer just Margaret's legacy. It had become ours, a sanctuary reborn, where chains had been broken, masks stripped away, and life finally allowed to breathe freely again. It was more than walls and gardens. It was peace. It was dignity. It was joy rediscovered. And as I looked at my son across the breakfast table one quiet morning, I knew this truth in my bones. The house was no longer a lonely inheritance. It was home. If you find today's story touching your emotions, please click the like button to support. Leave a comment to share your thoughts or experiences below. And especially don't forget to subscribe to the channel to accompany us in the next dramatic episodes. Each of your likes, comments, and subscriptions is the motivation for us to continue bringing more interesting and meaningful stories. ID